The moment Zarek Vossen saw her across the rooftop, the champagne flute in his hand stalled halfway to his lips. Thelasa Nix stood near the edge of the terrace, backlit by the shimmering city lights of the metropolis they had both fought to build. She was wearing a midnight blue dress that didn't apologize for a single thing. She wasn't supposed to be here, not at his 35th birthday gala, not in his world anymore. "Baby, who is that?" Ondine whispered, her manicured nails pressing into Zarek's expensive silk sleeve. "Nobody," he said too quickly, his voice tight with a sudden, sharp anxiety. "Just someone from before." But Thelasa wasn't looking at him. Her eyes tracked a figure moving with predatory grace through the crowd of tech journalists and city officials. And when Zarek followed her gaze, his stomach didn't just drop, it vanished. Osiris Vance. The billionaire investor who had been circling Zarek's company for months like a shark that never showed its teeth. The man whose signature on a single digital document could make or destroy empires before breakfast. Zarek watched, frozen, as Osiris crossed the entire party, ignoring the mayor, ignoring the press, ignoring everyone who mattered, and stopped in front of Thelasa like she was the only person in the room. "Are you ready, Miss Nix?" Osiris asked, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the nearby chatter. "It's time we showed them who actually built the foundation of this city. If you want to see how the woman Zarek tried to erase became the only person who could save him, stay with me, because what happens next changed everything." 4 years ago, everything had been different. Back then, the air didn't smell like expensive cologne and rooftop mist. It smelled like burnt coffee, ozone, and the desperation of 17 different startups crammed into a converted storage unit. Thelasa and Zarek worked in a corner space where the heating barely worked, convinced they were building the next big thing. "It's not working, Thal," Zarek had said at 2 a.m, his face pale in the blue light of his laptop. "The Vossen Spire is a beautiful concept, but the structural load is impossible. We're hemorrhaging investor interest because we can't prove the building won't sway in a light breeze." Thelasa hadn't looked up from her screen, her hair pulled back in a simple scarf, her eyes tired but sharp. "Let me see the flow patterns," she'd said quietly. 3 weeks later, she'd built something no one else thought possible, an adaptive structural engine that learned from environmental chaos. It turned architectural nightmares into seamless, gravity-defying choreography. "This is incredible," Zarek breathed, watching the test run. "Thelasa, you're a genius." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We're a team, Zarek. That's what makes it work." He'd kissed her then, and for a moment, Thelasa tasted hope and the future they were building together. But the first investor pitch changed everything. Thelasa stood backstage, her presentation loaded on her laptop, the one with all her notes, her diagrams, and the architecture only she truly understood. She had even adjusted his tie, the way she always did before important meetings. "You ready?" she'd ask. "We're ready," he'd replied. But when the lights hit and the investors leaned forward, Zarek walked out alone. He stood at the podium and said, "I am Zarek Vossen, and I am about to show you my breakthrough in the future of structural integrity." In the back row, Thelasa went very still. She watched as he presented her system as his innovation, and her sleepless nights as his singular vision. The team had become a me, and the partnership had become a performance. Thelasa waited for him in the concrete silence of the parking garage long after the applause had faded. When the elevator doors finally slid open, Zarek stepped out, loosening his tie, his face flushed with the high of success. "We killed it," he said, his voice echoing off the damp walls. "They're interested, Thal. Real money. This is the Series A we've been praying for." Thelasa didn't move. She stood by the driver's side door, her laptop bag heavy on her shoulder. "Why didn't you mention me, Zarek? Why didn't you say my name when they asked about the algorithm?" Zarek stopped, the celebratory smile flickering for just a second before it hardened into something condescending. "I said we and our team, Thelasa. Don't be difficult." "You said my breakthrough," she countered, her voice trembling. "I built my entire system while you were at lunch with donors. I wrote the code that keeps those towers from snapping in the wind." Zarek sighed, leaning against the car as if her demand for credit was an exhausting burden. "Look, you're a critical part of this, but investors don't bet on committees, Thal. They bet on a singular vision, one face, one story. That's how this works." "So I'm what? Your ghostwriter? Your assistant?" Zarek stepped closer, his voice dropping to a smooth, manipulative purr. "You're my wife. You're my co-founder. But when I'm up there, I need them to see certainty, not a debate." It became a pattern, a slow, methodical erasure. At press interviews, he was the architect genius. She was the talented wife who helped with technical matters. In board meetings, her structural innovations were presented as his strategic decisions. She watched, day by day, as the world fell in love with a man who was nothing more than a polished mask worn over her own brilliant mind. But the final blow came when she found the patent filings, documents that listed one name and one name only. The night Thelasa found the patent documents, the silence in their penthouse felt like a physical weight. She sat at the mahogany kitchen table until the city lights outside began to fade into the gray of dawn. In her hands was the filing for the Nix-Vossen load-bearing algorithm, except her name had been scrubbed from every line. When Zarek finally emerged, looking for his morning espresso, she didn't say a word. She simply slid the folder across the marble countertop. "Explain this," she said, her voice sounding like ice cracking. Zarek didn't even flinch. He barely glanced at the legal seal. "It's standard procedure, Thal. The company holds the IP. I'm listed as the primary inventor because I'm the CEO. It's cleaner for the investors." "I created that system, Zarek. I spent 6 months in a basement while you were at galas. I solved the math you said was impossible." Zarek sighed, that familiar patronizing sound he used whenever she challenged him. "This is business, Thal. This is how we protect what we've built. The company will compensate you fairly. You'll have a generous bonus at the end of the quarter." "What you've built?" she whispered. "That's what you mean, isn't it? Somewhere along the way, it stopped being ours and became yours." "Don't be dramatic," he snapped, finally looking at her. "You're upset, and I get it, but we can work through this." Thelasa stood up, her shadow long against the floor. "I want a divorce." The word hit the room like a structural failure. Zarek actually laughed, a short, nervous sound. "You don't mean that. You're just emotional because of the stress." "I mean it," she said, and for the first time in years, her voice was steady. "I'm out, Zarek. You can keep the name, and you can keep the penthouse, but you're about to find out exactly what the Vossen name is worth when the mind behind it leaves." The divorce lawyer's office was decorated in shades of beige and expensive silence. The man sitting across from Thelasa was gentle, but his words were like a series of small, precise cuts. "You won't get much, Ms. Nix," he said, tapping a pen against the desk. "The patents are filed under the company's name. Your contributions are documented in emails and drafts, but legally, they're classified as work product. You were an employee of your husband's firm." Thelasa stared out the window at the skyline she had helped design. "I built that firm from a warehouse, and he's treating me like a temp he can fire with a severance check." "We can fight it," the lawyer offered, "but it'll cost more in legal fees than you'll likely win in the end. He's prepared to bury you in motions until you're bankrupt." Thelasa looked at the thick stack of settlement papers. Zarek's legal team had drafted a masterpiece of exclusion. It stripped her of her title, her equity, and her history. She felt the urge to scream, to tear the papers to shreds. But then, she remembered the one thing Zarek always underestimated: her ability to see the structural flaw in any system. She took the pen. But before she signed, she insisted on one minor addition. She told them it was a recognition of past contributions for tax purposes. Zarek's high-priced lawyers barely scanned it. They were too busy celebrating their easy win over a distraught ex-wife. Buried in Section 7, subsection C, in the kind of dry legal language that made eyes glaze over, Thelasa wrote, "In recognition of ongoing utilization of proprietary systems developed by T. Nix, a contingent equity of 18% shall be activated upon any major capital event exceeding $50 million. At the time, the firm was bleeding cash and surviving on fumes. Zarek signed the papers with a smirk, thinking he was finally free of her. Thelasa walked away with nothing but her dignity and a clause that nobody thought would ever matter. She went into the shadows for 4 years, waiting for the one thing Zarek always knew about Zarek Vasin. He was too greedy to stay small forever. For 4 years, Thelasa Nix existed as a ghost in the industry she had helped revolutionize. While Zarek's face appeared on the covers of architectural digests, Thelasa moved into a quiet consultancy, operating under a string of shell companies. She didn't want the spotlight yet. She wanted the foundation. She spent those years refining the very algorithm Zarek was currently selling as his own. She knew every flaw in the Vossen vertex, every shortcut Zarek had taken to save money after she left. She wasn't just waiting, she was calculating the exact moment the structure of his lie would finally reach its breaking point. Meanwhile, Zarek was thriving on the surface. He had married Ondine, a woman who looked perfect on a balcony but never asked to see the blueprints. He had built a dynasty on the Nix-Vossen patents, but the company was hungry. To reach the next level, to build the legendary Nebula City, he needed more than just a famous name. He needed a massive infusion of capital. Enter Osiris Vance. Osiris was a man who didn't care for gala invitations or architectural awards. He was a billionaire investor who saw the world in lines of code and structural stress points. For months, Zarek had been courting him, offering tours of the vertex and promising that his singular vision was the future of the planet. What Zarek didn't know was that Osiris had already found the original development files. He had seen the messy, beautiful handwriting of a woman named Thelasa on every groundbreaking innovation. 3 days before the gala, Osiris had made his move. He didn't just invest, he triggered the major capital event Thelasa had waited 4 years to witness. As Zarek prepared for the party of his life, he had no idea that the silent architect was already standing in the lobby, ready to reclaim her name. The gala was a sea of shimmering silk and clinking crystal, but to Zarek, the air suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room. Across the terrace, Thelasa stood with a composure that made his own hands tremble. He abandoned Ondine mid-sentence, moving toward Thelasa and Osiris with a forced smile that felt like it might crack his face. He needed to neutralize this. He needed to get her away from the one man who could dismantle his life with a single phone call. "Mr. Vance," Zarek exclaimed, his voice a pitch too high, "I didn't know you'd be joining us tonight. What a pleasant surprise." He extended a hand, but Osiris Vance didn't even look at it. The billionaire remained turned toward Thelasa, his focus absolute. I came to meet the actual architect of the Vasin vertex, Osiris said, his voice cutting through the ambient music like a blade. I have a habit of identifying the actual talent in any organization. Zarek's extended hand fell to his side. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghost of the confident man who had walked in an hour ago. I'm sorry, Zarek stammered. Don't be, Osiris replied coldly. This is a common problem in this industry. People mistake the presentation for the substance. Osiris turned back to Thelasa. I have something I'd like to show you. Would you join me inside for a moment? Thelasa, Zarek said sharply, then caught himself, softening his tone with a desperate, oily warmth. I didn't even know you were coming tonight. How have you been? You look, well. Thelasa looked at him for the first time since she had arrived. Her gaze was clinical, as if she were inspecting a building with a fatal structural flaw. Busy, she said simply. You? Zarek laughed, but the sound was like breaking glass. Great! The company is taking off. We're in the middle of some exciting developments. So I hear, Thelasa replied, her tone perfectly neutral, yet vibrating with a hidden, terrifying power. The gala's ambient music seemed to fade into a dull hum as the circle of guests around them grew suspiciously quiet. People were turning their heads, sensing the shift in the air. Zarek felt the sweat prickle at his hairline. He needed to get Thelasa away from the crowd, away from the prying eyes of the board members who were already whispering. We should catch up, Zarek pressed, his voice dropping to an urgent, frantic whisper. Maybe coffee tomorrow. I'd love to tell you about where we've taken the platform. My platform, Thelasa corrected him gently, her voice clear enough to carry to the nearby tables. Let's be accurate, Zarek, since we're among friends. Zarek's jaw tightened so hard it ached. He forced a chuckle that sounded hollow and brittle. Of course, you were instrumental in the early development. I've always said— No, Osiris interrupted, his presence looming over Zarek like a storm front. You've never said. That's actually the problem. Undine appeared at Zarek's elbow then, her confusion obvious as she looked between her husband and the woman he had called a nobody just moments ago. Zarek, what's going on? Who is this? Nothing, sweetheart, just business talk, Zarek snapped, his mask of professional courtesy finally beginning to slip. He turned back to Thelasa, his eyes pleading. Can we speak privately, please? Why? Thelasa asked, tilting her head. We signed the papers, Zarek. Everything that needed to be said was said 4 years ago. That's not— Look, I know things ended badly, Zarek hissed, leaning in so close Thelasa could smell the expensive gin on his breath. I know I made mistakes, but whatever Osiris has told you— He hasn't told me anything I didn't already know, Thelasa said, her voice rising in a cold, steady crescendo. I wrote the code, Zarek. Every algorithm, every load-bearing model, every line that made your company worth investing in. I know exactly what it's worth because I am the one who built it. The terrace had gone completely silent now, the only sound being the distant hum of the city and the frantic pulse drumming in Zarek's ears. Osiris Vance checked his watch with a cold, mechanical precision. We should move this inside, Osiris stated, his voice ringing with an authority that brooked no argument. The announcement is about to begin. What announcement? Zarek's voice cracked, a jagged sound that betrayed his mounting terror. You'll see, Osiris replied, a shark-like smile touching his lips. Osiris offered Thelasa his arm. She took it with the grace of a queen reclaiming her throne, leaving Zarek standing on the rooftop with Undine still clutching his sleeve in a grip of pure confusion. His own birthday party had been transformed into a slow-motion wreck. Inside, the main room had been quietly rearranged while the guests were on the terrace. A small, stark podium now stood exactly where the 5-tier birthday cake had been. Massive high-definition screens flashed to life on every wall, bathing the room in a clinical white light. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host's voice boomed over the speakers. "If you could join us inside, please. We have a special presentation from tonight's primary sponsor, Osiris Vance." The crowd filed in, buzzing with a mixture of curiosity and predatory interest. They could smell the blood in the water. Zarek pushed through the tuxedoed bodies, his breath coming in shallow hitches, trying desperately to reach the front of the room before the first slide appeared. Osiris stepped to the podium like he owned the very air in the lungs of everyone present. He didn't look like an investor, he looked like a judge. "Good evening," Osiris began, his voice cutting through the whispers like a structural beam. "I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but I believe in correcting catastrophic errors whenever I find them. And in the case of the Vossen Vertex, I have found a significant one." The room went dark, and the screens behind the podium suddenly bled with lines of glowing emerald code. It wasn't a marketing video or a slideshow of finished buildings. It was the raw, beautiful architecture of the adaptive flow engine. "This," Osiris said, gesturing to the complex scrolling math, "is the system that powers Vossen Logistics. It is the reason I was prepared to invest $65 million 3 days ago." Osiris paused, letting the complexity of the work sink in. Zarek reached the front of the crowd, his face pale and slick with sweat. "But I found a problem," Osiris continued, his voice dropping an octave. "This system was not created by Zarek Vossen. It was created by Thelasa Nix." The screens shifted. Photos appeared, not of Zarek at ribbon cuttings, but of Thelasa years ago. She was standing in front of whiteboards covered in her dense, elegant handwriting. There were timestamps from the early warehouse days, digital signatures on the core algorithms that predated the firm's formal incorporation. One woman working night after night, solving problems that entire departments couldn't crack, Osiris said, his gaze sweeping the room. "Not the man whose name is on the door." "This is completely inappropriate," Zarek shouted, his voice cracking as he stepped into the light. "This is a private event. My lawyers will have your—" "What's inappropriate," Osiris cut him off, his voice like a gavel, "is intellectual theft, the theft of credit, the theft of truth." The crowd erupted into a feverish murmur. The investors who had once praised Zarek as a genius were now looking at him with the cold curiosity of people watching a building collapse in real time. Zarek looked at the screen, then at Thelasa, who was standing beside the podium with a face like carved stone. He realized then that it wasn't just his reputation on the line, it was everything. The room was a vacuum of shocked silence until Osiris Vance stepped down from the podium and stood directly in front of Zarek Vossen. "When I invested $65 million into your firm 3 days ago, Zarek, I triggered a very specific clause in your divorce settlement," Osiris said, his voice echoing with a finality that made Zarek's knees buckle. "A clause that recognizes Thelasa Nix's foundational work and grants her 18% equity in this company upon any major capital event." The room erupted into a feverish roar of whispers. Zarek's face went a ghostly shade of white as he looked at his former wife. "You can't," Zarek stammered. "That clause isn't legally binding. We'll fight this in every court in the country." "Please do," Osiris replied with a cold, predatory smile. "I've already had 3 top-tier law firms review it. It's ironclad. Your own lawyers signed off on it because the company was worth nothing back then." "The company was worth nothing without me," Thelasa spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice steady and clear. I didn't come here for revenge, she told the room, her eyes never leaving Zarek's. I came because 4 years ago, you told me that investors don't bet on partnerships, they bet on one face, one story. You were right about that, Zarek, but you chose the wrong face. As of tomorrow morning, Thelasa Nix was officially the second largest shareholder in the firm. Her name would be restored to every patent, every blueprint, and every press release. Zarek was left standing in his own wreckage, his reputation gone, his board in revolt, and his new wife, Ondine, finally letting go of his arm for good. Thelasa walked toward the exit, her head held high. At the door, she turned back one last time. Happy birthday, Zarek. I hope the ego was worth the equity. She stepped out into the cool, clean night air, leaving the chaos behind. She had bet on herself, and for the first time, everyone knew her name. If the story of Thelasa's reckoning moved you, let me know in the comments what moment hit hardest, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss what happens when the truth finally comes to light.